Well, one of the main spiritual lessons that we're to learn from the days of unleavened bread is about the insidiousness and subtleness of sin. And that word insidious actually means intended to entrap, to beguile, deceitful, seemingly harmless, but with grave effect. Let's look at a couple of physical examples that we go through each year as we get ready for the Passover. And they are about leaven. And one is, leaven is where you don't think to look, right? I mean, how many times do we not think to look for someplace, like an old suitcase, or your purse, or clothes, or pockets? Another thing is leaven is where you would never expect it to be, like a flat wheat thin. Who would imagine a wheat thin has leaven in it? So we have to be careful we don't eat leaven or wheat thins. It's also in hard-to-get places, like a toaster or under the refrigerator. It's also hard to recognize when you see it, like a fortune cookie or crackers. Who would think of that being leavened? It's also in places that you know about but forgot, like the vacuum cleaner or the freezer. The point is about the physical leaven is that we don't always see and recognize the spiritual leaven that's in us, especially for what it is, nor do we have the proper desire to get rid of it. Today we're going to look and see that there is a deceptive leaven that Jesus Christ warned us to be very careful to avoid in our life. Let's turn to Leviticus chapter 23, and we'll see God's instruction about the holy days that he laid out for us here in Leviticus chapter 23, beginning in verse 4. Leviticus chapter 23 and in verse 4. God tells us, "These are the feasts of the Lord, even holy convocations, which you shall proclaim in their seasons. In the 14th day of the first month at even is the Lord's Passover. And on the 15th day of the same month is the feast of unleavened bread unto the Lord. Even 7 days you must eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall have a holy convocation. You shall do no servile work therein, but you shall offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord 7 days. And in the seventh day is a holy convocation. You shall do no servile work therein." And he emphasizes here a couple of times, we don't want to forget, that he says it's a holy convocation. All of God's holy days, whether the feast days or the Sabbath, are to be considered holy time before God. And that means having his presence with us at that time, so that our conversation, our studies, are based on God's word, not on the physical things that we have in our life. Turning over to Exodus chapter 13. When we read back in Leviticus 23, he laid out for us all of the holy days, and they were introducing God's plan for all of mankind that's going to be coming when he returns, that the holy days represent. But in Exodus chapter 13, in verse 3, we read, "And Moses said to the people, Remember this day in which you came out from Egypt, out of the house of bondage. For by strength of hand the Lord brought you out from this place. And there shall be no leavened bread eaten." So these days represent our coming out of this world, made free by Christ's sacrifice for us. We've been freed from the bondage of Satan and this world's sins that we have grown up with and live with every day. He's taken us out of that when we were baptized and had a relationship with him and the Father. Going back in Exodus chapter 12, one chapter, and in verse 15, notice also what we're to remember these days. God tells us, Exodus 12 and verse 15, he says, 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, and on the first day you shall remove leaven from your houses. For whoever eats leavened bread from the first day until the seventh day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. So here we saw that God was telling us that we are to be eating unleavened bread, but here he's making sure that we're clear that we are to put away leavened bread. We're not to eat anything leavened. When he says here, for whoever eats leavened bread, he's saying that as one who has chosen to reject the way of life. One who eats leavened bread during that time is rejecting the way of life that makes possible the continuance of God's grace, which God has refused to impute sin on those who stumble accidentally. We've been imputed from sin because of God's grace and mercy. We don't have that burden on us now. We've been given the information that we are free from that sin, that penalty, what's going to come. So if we purposely let sin reign, as he says, whoever eats of this, if we purposely let sin reign in us, he says we will be cut off from God. Cut off. So we must be very careful to avoid what leaven and leavened bread symbolizes. We must be alert to sin, not just during the days of unleavened bread. This is not just a one-week event in our life, but at all times throughout our life. People in worldly religions, they keep their holy days. They keep it one day. They'll keep it for a couple of days, whatever the time frame is on it, and that's it. These days, God is telling us, is to be a part of our life. We must be alert to sin, and not just doing it on the 7 days, as I said, but throughout our entire life. We have the obligation to prevent our lives from becoming leavened by sin. Now, the number 7, as he tells us that we are to eat this for 7 days and not eat the leavened bread for 7 days, pictures a completeness and perfection. So the 7 days he's talking about here for us represents all of our lifetime with God. Our entire time with him is what those 7 days will represent for us. Now let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 5. Let's see what Paul's instruction is for us today. 1 Corinthians chapter 5. Reading from the New King James Version. Paul says, it is actually reported that there are sexual immorality among you, and such sexual immorality as is not even named among the Gentiles. Even the Gentiles aren't doing this, yet I'm hearing things that you're doing that are ungodly. And he says that a man has a father's wife. So here's a man who was having a relationship with his stepmother, his father's wife, and Paul says here, and you are puffed up and have not even mourned. You didn't mourn about this. He that has done this deed might be taken away from among you. Verses 6 and 7, he goes on and says, your glorying is not good. Know you not that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? So he says, purge out therefore the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, as you are unleavened during the unleavened bread time. For even Christ our Passover is sacrificed for us. So Paul was saying here, look at your arrogant pride about the allowance of this sin. It isn't good. You don't realize that just a little leaven ferments the whole lump of dough. A little bit of that leaven. He was telling them, you should have been mourning over this situation. You should have been seeing this as a sinful act by someone in your group and have him removed from there, because you have to get rid of the leaven, the old leaven, and take on the new and be a new lump before God. So the way leaven works in a physical way is that it's deposited in one area of dough, and it begins to grow, and the growth that is produced invades and grows in other areas of the dough. So you put that piece of dough and you put one little piece of leaven in one little spot, and before you know it, the entire piece grows from it. And then it continues in the process until at last the total mass of dough has been invaded and conquered by the leaven. So Paul here is referring to the examples of leaven, meaning sin, that invades our entire body and life and how we think and how we act. Turn over to James chapter 1. Something else here that we see has been instructed for us. James chapter 1, beginning in verse 12. James says here, blessed is the man who endures temptation, for when he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life which the Lord has promised to those who love him. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does God tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. And that word means entrapped, to be entrapped by our own desire to do this. Then when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. He goes on and says, do not be deceived, my beloved brethren. So we're being told here by James, be careful that we don't make a mistake in giving in to sin. The way Paul was telling the Corinthians, be careful what you are doing. You need to be aware of what's going on. James is telling us here that we have to be careful, because once this happens, We're introducing sin into our life that is eventually going to bring forth eternal death. So because we're under grace, we have a responsibility before God to endure, to overcome temptation and lust. We have that responsibility because Christ died for our sins. And God gave us that grace, that freedom from that sin, that bondage isn't there anymore. When we do, we have one respect. In one respect, we have then put out sin when we have done this. We've prevented sin from coming into our lives. Now that word endure that he mentioned there, enduring temptation, it means mental and emotional strength in facing difficulty, adversity, danger, or temptation, and doing it courageously. Enduring temptation. When we can do that by our mental and emotional strength, we can overcome this problem and not let it eventually destroy us. Now, whether it's in the Old Testament, back in Leviticus, Exodus, or in the New Testament, a couple of verses we've just read, human nature does not want to put the leaven out and doesn't even know that it's there. Human nature doesn't realize that we have leaven in us, that we have sin in us. So a couple of questions. Is de-leavening fun? No. Even in the physical plane when we unleaven the house, it's not fun. A lot of work we got to do. Get it all done before Passover. So de-leavening is not fun, physical or even spiritual, but it's a part of our life. It's something that we are supposed to be doing now. It doesn't, leaven also doesn't want to be told that it's wrong. How many people want to be told they're wrong about something? Being corrected is not fun. Who wants to hear that? It doesn't want to look at it when it is told. When you hear it, you don't even want to look at it. It also doesn't want to bother to change it even when it knows it's there. That's human nature. That's what we've been made of. But God gave us an ability to do something about it. We don't have to take that human nature and use it as an excuse why we're not doing things. We have God's Spirit to make the changes. Turn to Matthew chapter 16. Let's notice Jesus Christ's strong instruction to his disciples concerning leaven. And clearly, brethren, we could see whether it's the Old Testament or the New Testament, this is a very important subject for us to be aware of. This is not just something we do for a ritual every year during the days of Passover and unleavened bread. This is something that we have to be aware of for our life, our human life. Matthew chapter 16 and verse 5. Now when when his disciples had come to the other side, they had been away for some time, and they had been at an event where there was bread and fish that were made available for people. When they came to the other side, they had forgotten to take bread. And Jesus said to the disciples, "Take heed and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees." Now Jesus was not speaking about physical leaven, but his disciples, they didn't understand that when he was telling them about this. They didn't get it. Dropping down to verse 11. He says, "How is it that you do not understand that I spoke not to you concerning bread, that you should beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and of the Sadducees?" I wasn't talking about bread. Because you didn't bring any bread with you is not what I was talking about. The leaven of the Pharisees that he was talking about, they didn't get it. Verse 12. Then they understood that he did not tell them to beware of the leaven of bread, but of the doctrine of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The doctrine, meaning the teachings of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So this leaven he's speaking about here is related to the Pharisees' teachings. And he's telling them, in essence, it's false teaching. Teaching which corrupts instead of producing righteousness. This leaven was and is still an invincible and persuasive sin, and hidden away deep within the heart. Like leaven that works its way through the fresh dough, spreading out through until it is evident in the entire batch, so as well false ideas and notions, doctrinally unsound teachings, are allowed to infiltrate our minds and will, if unchecked, gradually penetrate into every part of our thinking and how we live and how we act. talking about their false ideas, their notions, their doctrines, things that they were, unsound teachings that they were passing on. But in verse 6, he was being very emphatic to them when he warned them by saying, take heed. That word take heed means to see. He's telling us, be careful, be sure that you see, pay attention, watch out, and discern carefully, he's letting them know. Take heed. Then he said, beware. That means be cautious, to be on one's guard. We have to ask ourselves, how would we react if Jesus Christ told us to watch out and be cautious and pay attention? Well, he is. Right here in these verses. He's not just telling his disciples, beware. He's telling us, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. Beware of those who are teaching error and lies rather than the truth of God. Again, that word doctrine means teaching or instructions. Now, the self-righteousness quality of the Pharisees, it can grow and infect the mind and character of those that are listening to them. It's going to become a part of them as well. Now, the Pharisees, as we want to know about them a little bit, they were considered model citizens of Israel. They were accepted leaders simply by virtue of their zeal for the letter of the law. Because they were so zealous for the law and what they made the law sound like, it had a great impact on the people that were listening to them. That zeal for the letter of the law, which they mixed with the oral law passed on by others that they were taught from. This oral law that was being passed on through the ages. And these Pharisees, they knew it all. They had everything that they needed to know. They knew everything. If you wanted to know something, go see the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and you'll find out. The word Pharisee in the Hebrew is parash, and it means to separate and literally to disperse or to wound. Interesting what Pharisees meant. The Sadducees, well, they taught that there was no resurrection or angels or spirits. They were on the other side of the righteous Pharisees and how they taught. The Sadducees were very liberal in their approach to things. Back in Acts chapter 23, only one verse we can catch here, Acts 23 and verse 8, Paul says, for the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, neither angel nor spirit, but the Pharisees, they confess both. They agree to both of those things, but the Pharisees don't. The overly righteous Pharisees and the liberal Sadducees were causing confusion and division among the Jews. This is why Christ was so hard on this, because of what they were doing, and the people didn't see it. They didn't realize what they were hearing was so grotesque and wrong. Now, as much as they were different on these different things, Sadducees and Pharisees believing different things, yet they were both in agreement to being critical and judgmental of who Jesus Christ was, to the point where they wanted him dead. Mark chapter 8. Mark chapter 8 and verse 15. Another here example of Jesus using the term about leaven of the Pharisees. Mark 8 and verse 15, Jesus says, be careful, he warned them. Watch out for the leaven of the Pharisees and that of Herod. So many people thought, well, why did he bring up Herod? Because he's using that term, the leaven of the Pharisees and of Herod. He's speaking here about the Sadducees. Because the Sadducees, as being liberal, were very supportive of Herod and his rulership. And they were very politically correct. They went along with whatever Herod was going to be going about and doing. His supporters taught loyalty to Rome. They were called Herodians, being loyal to Rome. Another politically correct mindset. So the false teaching, even today, is that human government has all the solutions. As long as it's a government, something ruling people, they have all the answers and they know it all. So Jesus was using these examples, whether it was Pharisees and Sadducees or using the example of the Sadducees with Herod, he's telling them to beware of this. It's dangerous. Turn to Mark chapter 7. Let's look at an example of the Pharisees and all this intellect that they had, all this knowledge of the law that they had, and they were so strong with. Mark chapter 7, look how they acted. Mark 7, verse 6. I'm reading this from the ESV. It says, "And he said to them, well did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written, this people honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me." Verse 7, "In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men." Not God's word. They're teaching the commandments of men, that oral teaching that they had, that oral law that they were passing around. He goes on, vain, empty, and without meaning are those doctrines that he's talking about. That's what they meant. Vain, empty, and without meaning. Verse 8, he says, "You leave the commandment of God and hold to the tradition of men." And he said to them, "You have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to establish your tradition. For Moses said, 'Honor your father and your mother, and whoever reviles his father or mother must surely die.'" So what did the Pharisees do? I mean, we've got to come up with a whole different perspective here, because if we don't do what God says here to mothers and fathers, we'll be dead. So we've got to come up with something. Well, they did. He goes on and says, "But you say, if a man tells his father or his mother, 'Whatever you would have gained from me is Corban.'" That means that which is given to God. So what they did was they come up with this concept, this idea, with this Corban, that they were able to tell their parents that we've got money. I've got my all my savings, my 401k, all the things I've got in my life, got all that money there, but I have to give it to Corban, and that means that it's given to God. Now the reality is they never gave the money to anything, but they used the term to their parents that I'm donating the money. When? Never said when, but they were going to donate the money at some point, they said, to this Corban. Verse 12, "That you no longer permit him to do anything for his father or his mother." So when you do this, you're telling your parents, we're putting the money away, but I can't give you anything because that money's there, so I'm sorry about that. Verse 13, "Thus making void the word of God by your tradition that you have handed down, and many such things that you do." How many traditions, brethren, have we taken in our lives through the years that have changed things for us? That word tradition, by the way, means giving up by instruction, or giving over which is done by word of mouth. That which is delivered by the substance of teaching someone. That's what a tradition is. Something that is delivered by the teaching. I look back and I think all the years that we've been in the church and how we would look at the night to be much observed. A night that God says is a holy night. It's the first night of unleavened bread. And I remember years ago, we made reservations in hotels, restaurants, and we'd have all kinds of things set up in the room, and it was a party. And it was holy night. Where was the holy part of that when we make it into a social event in that way? Now, eating together is not wrong, especially on a holy night when you can be together in unity with God. That's great. But where's the holy part of it? Well, it was a tradition that we did, and we just did it year after year and never really evaluated it. So there are things that we do through life that are that way. And as the Pharisees used this Corban, I've heard of people who have had to donate their homes and all their money that they've acquired in their banks, donate it to the organization, the church, because that's what they were told to do. Now, I don't see it in the Bible as being that way, but that's what they are doing. Tradition, following somebody's teaching. During Christ's earthly ministry, he often rebuked the Pharisees for their false teachings. Do we believe that our minds can accept unsound teaching and not be affected in our life? After all, it's what we believe, how we think, that affects how we act. What we believe and how we think is going to be the result after in what we do in our life and how we act. Let's see Jesus' warning to us again concerning what he called this deadly leaven. Luke 12 and verse 1. Luke chapter 12 and verse 1. Luke 12, verse 1, it says, "In the meantime, when they were gathered together in an innumerable multitude of people, insomuch that they trode one upon another, he began to say to his disciples, first of all, beware you of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy." Now, he mentioned earlier that it was the doctrine. Well, the doctrine that they were teaching was their hypocrisy. They were hypocrites. So their doctrine that was coming out of their mouth was hypocritical, as far as Christ was letting us know. So this, again, is the old leaven that Paul spoke, that corrupts, that contaminates. Hypocrisy reflects the lives, the actions, the mindsets of these leaders of the Jews. It reflected their lives and their actions. So what is hypocrisy? What is that word? The Greek meaning of hypocrisy, the word is hypokritias. I'm not good at speaking Greek, but it means an actor. It means playing a part on a stage, being a dissembler, separating things, taking them apart. In the Hebrew, the word means to be soiled, impious, and polluted. Webster's dictionary says, hypocrisy, the root meaning is to play a part or to pretend, a faking of what one is not, the acting of a false part, a deception as to the real character and feeling, a deception of what they're really trying to tell you. So a synonym of hypocrisy is being a deceiver. Now, a deceiver, when you go back in history, it's one who puts on a mask and feigns himself to be what he is not, to feel what he does not feel himself actually being. Now, back in the Greek days, back in the Old Testament, or early centuries, Greeks' the plays that they had often had actors wearing different masks on their faces. And it gave the illusion of either a happy face or a sad face. So they would switch the faces whenever they were in a play so that the people knew at the time whether they were happy, whether they were sad. And the actor was actually called a hypocrite, someone who wore two faces, or being two-faced, as we use the term today. It's a concealing of one's real character, a disposition of motives, especially the assuming of false appearance of virtue or religion. It means simulating goodness, but not being. As Christ said that they worshipped him with their mouth, but not with their actions and not what they did. Insincerity by virtue of pretending to have qualities or beliefs that you do not really have. Not sincere with what they're doing. Hypocrisy is pure deception and get. It is an attempt to fool others and control them in what they do. They wanted to get the acceptance and approval of others. That was what the Pharisees wanted. They wanted to have people to give them this look up to them like they were super and special. They were very important. They were the best knowledgeable people about God's word. They were concerned about their image, what they look like to others. And they wanted to get something that they wanted. Not what the people wanted or needed or what God wanted them to do. So hypocrisy is lying. It's misrepresenting oneself for something else. It's the refusal to apply ourselves the same standards that we apply to others. It's one thing to tell someone to do something, but you're not doing it yourself. So hypocrisy entails living a lie. The Pharisees represented themselves as those who were doing things God's way. But in fact, they were obeying their own standard of righteousness, what that was, what they made it to be. They picked and chose the truths that they were willing to obey, but ignored the other truths which were not part of their standard. They chose things that they were willing to obey. Washing their hands, washing a cup, but not the other things. So how does God view hypocrisy? What does God say about it? What do we see in the Bible about this? Turn to Proverbs chapter 6. Proverbs chapter 6. And in verse 16. Proverbs 6 and verse 16. God tells us here, these 6 things does the Lord hate. There's a very strong word there. He says he hates it. Yes, even 7 are an abomination unto him. So God is making it very clear. This is something that he's going to list out here that he despises. It's something that we have to be careful that we're not doing this. We don't want to be accused of what he's saying this about something else, someone else. So these things does God hate and are abomination. A proud look, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked imaginations, feet that are swift in running to mischief and not doing what they should, a false witness that speaks lies, and he that sows discord among the brethren. I guess if you look at this carefully, you'll see that all 7 of these things that God says he hates are things that would be fitting into what a hypocrite is. The failure to practice what one preaches and appearing outwardly righteous. Those things can apply to all 7 of these hatred things that God lays out here. Deuteronomy chapter 4. Deuteronomy chapter 4 and in verse 1. Reading from the NIV. Deuteronomy 4 verse 1, it says, Hear now, O Israel, the decrees and the laws I am about to teach you. Follow them so that you may live and may go on and take possession of the land that the Lord, the God of your fathers, is giving to you. Do not add to what I command you and do not subtract from it, but keep the commands of the Lord your God that I give you. So we're being told here right from the Old Testament, doesn't end when Christ came the first time. He says, do not add what I command you, do not subtract from it. He said, follow them so that you may live. This is how important this is to God and for us, brethren, that we just take for granted these things. As we mentioned earlier about the meaning of leaven and how people don't want to look at it, don't want to think about it, don't want to see it, don't want to hear it. But he's saying here, I'm going to teach you something and you need to follow what I say, not what you're getting from somebody who's not following my word. Now, if they're following God's word to the point that God is telling us, fine. They're teachers, they're instructors, that's great. But when they start adding to things that God says and twisting the word of God, he says, beware of that and avoid it. Let's go back to 1 Samuel chapter 28. 1 Samuel chapter 28. We'll start to notice a couple of examples now that we see of this in the Bible, this attitude. 1 Samuel chapter 28 and in verse 7. Now, just prior to verse 7 here, the Philistines were coming into battle against Israel, and King Saul was becoming very afraid that this was going to happen. Verse 7, and Saul said to his servants, Seek me a woman that has a familiar spirit, that I may go to her and inquire of her. And his servant said to him, Behold, there is a woman that lives nearby here and has a familiar spirit at Endor. Now, if you look back a little further here in chapter 28, after Samuel had died, Saul had banned the spiritualists from the land. Yet here he disguised himself and desired to counsel from a spiritualist. God did not answer him. Because in verse 6 it says, When Saul inquired of the Lord, the Lord answered him not, neither by dreams, nor by Urim, nor by prophets. So he had asked God, but there's no sincerity in what he was doing. Because he had hidden these women from that. Now let's go back to Leviticus 20, verse 1. Leviticus chapter 20. And beginning in verse 1. It says, And the Lord spoke unto Moses and said, Again you shall say to the children of Israel, whoever he is, be of the children of Israel, or the strangers that sojourn in Israel, to give any of his seed to Molech, he shall surely be put to death. And the people of the land shall stone him. And he goes on to talk in there a few verses that they would avoid going to these people and inquiring with them or talking with them. But in verse 6, it says, and the soul that turns after such, these type of people that have a familiar spirit, and after wizards, to go whoring after them, I will even set my face against that soul, and will cut him off from among his people. Verse 27, Leviticus 20, it says, a man also or a woman that has a familiar spirit, or that has a wizard, shall surely be put to death. They shall stone them with stones, and their blood shall be upon them. Now what happened when Saul was afraid that the Philistines were going to come, and he didn't get a response from God, so he went and got this woman. Now why hadn't he killed all of these people that were doing this rather than put them away? Why? Because he knew that at some point I'm going to have to go back there and check it out. I may have to get some input from them later. But God said here in Leviticus 20 that you were to destroy them and kill them, not have them be alive. So 1 Chronicles chapter 10 and verse 13, continuing a follow-up on this story with Saul. 1 Chronicles chapter 10 and verse 13, it says, so Saul died for the transgression which he committed against the Lord, even against the word of the Lord which he kept not. So because he disobeyed God, God says he died here because of his transgression. Also, it says, for asking counsel of one that had a familiar spirit to inquire of it, and inquired not of the Lord. Therefore he slew him and turned the kingdom unto David the son of Jesse. So God is telling us here that even though it says he asked God, there was no sincerity there. God is not going to hear from somebody who's talking like that, when he should have killed those people first before putting them in a storage bin to be able to use them later on like he did. And it didn't work. Certainly didn't work when he went to her. Now we always focus on Saul's disqualifying himself for his disobedience. But do we ride the fence of wanting God's way and keeping it a little of the world, a little bit of the world when we want it or when we need it like he did? Do we kind of do that way? Do we see that even though he died for disobeying God, are we going to do in our life that, keep a little bit of things here, keep it in our back pocket so we can use it whenever we want? There must be a heartfelt desire to know what God directs. That's what he wasn't doing. How about us? Do we know all that God expects us as Christians to be doing? Are we following that direction like our life depends on it? Because it didn't work for Saul. He didn't get from her what he thought he was going to get, but he got from God what God said he was going to get. Turn to Galatians chapter 2. Now we saw something in the Old Testament here. Now let's go ahead into the New Testament. Galatians chapter 2. And beginning in verse 11. Galatians 2 and in verse 11. It says, when Peter came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face. Now this is Paul speaking. Because he was clearly in the wrong. Paul says, when Peter came here, I had a face-to-face with him and talk about this. Verse 12. Before certain men came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. So some men were coming from James to visit. And at that time, prior to that, he was eating with the Gentiles. But when they arrived, these Jews that came from James he began to draw back and separate himself from the Gentiles, because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group. Verse 13. The other Jews joined him in his hypocrisy, so that by their hypocrisy, even Barnabas was led away. Now notice how this infects other people. So when Paul came to him, he told him, what you were doing was wrong. If you were eating with the Gentiles, that was fine. But when the Jews came, you didn't want to show them that there was a difference between Jews and Gentiles? Don't you remember what God showed you earlier with the coming down from heaven, that there was going to be other people that were going to be not Jews, that were going to be of God? Verse 14, when I saw that they were not acting in line with the truth of the gospel, I said to Peter in front of them all, you are a Jew, yet you live like a Gentile and not like a Jew. So you're living like a Gentile, you're cooperating with them. So how is it then that you force the Gentiles to have to follow the Jewish customs and being caring about circumcision? So here we have Peter, an apostle, with other believers that were separating from the Gentiles and pretending that the motive was loyalty to the law of Moses, whereas really it was fear of the legalists that wanted circumcision not to be done away with, which God said needed to be stopped as an official qualification. So Peter here should have known better than to be hypocritical and to not do what was right. But again, brethren, how much of these things affects us? Even an apostle that was taught by Christ, that worked with him directly, yet he gave in to that. And even Barnabas got on board with it. And Paul says, look, I've got to speak out against this. I just can't let this go and just let it go, be quiet about it. I can't say, well, it's Paul, it's Peter. What am I going to say? It's Peter, he's an apostle. So I can't say anything. No, he went in and he stood up to that and made it clear that being a hypocrite was wrong and not of God. Probably the most noticeable was the Pharisees' continual confronting Jesus Christ. Turn to Matthew chapter 23. We'll begin there in verse 1. Matthew 23. Jesus here had harsh words for anyone who lives by this standard. Matthew 23, verse 1. Then Jesus spoke to the multitudes and to his disciples and said, the scribes and the Pharisees, they sit in Moses' seat. Therefore, whatever they tell you, you observe. That observe and do it, but do not do according to their works. For they say and they do not do. Now, they were still talking about the commandments. They were still talking about the law, but they were doing both, the law and the written law of God and the oral law that was coming down from their background. So there were things that they needed to listen to, but he says, but watch, because the things that they do, don't follow that example, because they're doing something and they're saying something but not doing it. Verse 4, for they bind heavy burdens, hard to bear, and they lay them on men's shoulders. But they themselves will not move them without moving a finger. Everything that they do is done for men to see. It's done for others to watch what they are doing, to be looking up to them as special. And love the uppermost rooms at the feasts. That's what they wanted to be. They wanted to be standing up before other people. And the chief seats in the synagogues. They had to sit at the best seats in the meeting hall, wherever they went, the synagogue. Moses taught that as God had given him to do, and that's not what the Pharisees were doing. God had not placed the Pharisees in Moses' seat. Rather, they themselves sat in Moses' seat. And that was a place of authority, of working with people and helping them, that Moses did in counseling with people and judging things that they were doing. They were trying to take that place, but God had not given it to them. They wanted others to look up to them. They were filled with self-importance, a life of outward showing, telling others what to do, but not living it, and not applying what is learned. Verse 14, Jesus said, now, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites! For you devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayers. Therefore you will receive great condemnation. So what were they doing here? They would make sure that the widows did not receive what was supposed to be for their care and their well-being. They were taking their homes and they were selling them, getting rid of them, taking the money for themselves. You devour the widows' houses and make a pretense of long prayer. And what they were doing then was making people hear the prayers for the widows. They were praying for them openly and outwardly, showing such concern for the widows. But the reality is they were hypocrites. They weren't taking care of the widows. They were making themselves righteous and sound like they were loving and caring. Verse 15, woe to you teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You travel over land and sea with a single convert, and when he becomes one, you make him twice as much the son of hell as you are. He knew that the damage of their poisonous, hypocritical attitudes, what that would cause. That these Pharisees pretended to be spiritually strong, but were carnal. And they sounded righteous, but lacked spiritual substance. And their false teachings, and what they did to these other people, was causing them to be led away from God. They were becoming as bad or worse than they were from hearing their teachings and becoming just like them. Verse 23, woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give a tenth of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. You blind guides which strain at a gnat and swallow a camel. So you're tithing, you're doing that, but you're neglecting the more important issues. It wasn't wrong to tithe, he's telling them. It wasn't wrong for you to be doing that, what you were doing, but what about the part that you were neglecting? The important issues, the spiritual issues. See, the hypocrites could not understand the spirit of the law. Why? Because it's written in the heart. Verse 25. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You clean outside of the cup and the dish, but inside they are full of greed and selfish indulgence. You blind Pharisees, first clean the inside of the cup and the dish, and then outside the cup will be clean. When we unleaven our homes, that is not the only thing we're doing. That is only to give us a reminder of that, how leaven is in different places that we don't see in our life. It's something that we're learning from it. It's not that that's what we're doing to do that. We're to clean the inside, not just the outside, not just the house is clean. Oh, we did a great job. We've been cleaning the house for a month, and it's perfect. That means we are perfect. No. We're to clean the inside of the cup, which is what they did not do. They were more concerned about what something looked outside. Verse 27, woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You are like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside you're full of dead man's bones, and everything is unclean. In the same way, on the outside you appear to people as being righteous, but on the inside you're full of hypocrisy and wickedness. See, their life, or the life of a hypocrite, is a shallow facade of what they teach. Very shallow. Oh, they teach it. Sounds good, but they're not living it. Verse 33, you snakes, you brood of vipers, how will you escape being so condemned? How will you escape this? He says, you're snakes and vipers. There was no one else that I see in the Bible that Christ came down so hard on directly that he did with the Pharisees and the Sadducees, calling them snakes and vipers. You don't hear him talking about the Gentiles like that, or those that did not know about God. No, he's talking about people who were supposedly teaching about God's word and being hypocrites. That word woe, it means an exclamation of grief and deep sorrow. While it's a strong word, Jesus was very sorrowed over this, that they were doing this. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees. So how does hypocrisy affect us in our life? What are we looking at? This problem didn't begin or end at the time that Jesus was dwelling with these Pharisees. This wasn't the beginning and end. We saw it went back in the Old Testament, how people acted and did things, as well as when Christ was there. But it has been part of a man's application of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and is alive and well in the church of God prior to the time of Christ's return. Prior to the return of Jesus Christ's time, which is the time we're living in now. Part of man's application from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. What did Adam and Eve do in the garden? They listened to somebody telling them, disrupting God's word and telling them that you're not going to die if you eat that. No, God was not telling. That's not true. And they believed him. They went along with that heresy, that hypocrite, that he was teaching them something that was not from God. So it goes back quite a ways. But let's turn to 2 Timothy chapter 3. Notice Paul's warning for the church today. 2 Timothy 3, verse 1. Paul says here, know also that in the last days, this is the last days. I mean, we are right near the end when Christ returns. We don't know the date, but Judging from what we're going through and seeing today and what the church is like today, he says, this is the last days. And he goes on and says, perilous times or imminent danger shall come. Perilous times, imminent danger shall come. And it also means it's a breakdown of character. It's through the idea of reducing strength. These perilous times, something's going to change from what we should have been at the end time. It's a breakdown of character. Verse 2, for men shall be lovers of their own selves, covetous, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, without natural affection, truce breakers, false accusers, incontinent, fierce, despisers of those that are good. Verse 4, traitors, high-minded, lovers of pleasures more than lovers of God. Verse 5, having a form of godliness, or meaning phonies. They were phonies. But denying the power of, therefore, from such turn away. For of this sort are they which creep into houses, and lead captive silly women laden with sins, and led away with lusts. So Paul is letting us know here how many things are evil at the end time when Christ comes back. Now we thought, we're the church, we're perfect. There's nothing, nobody knows anything like we know. We're the perfect people. And yet he's telling us here, at this time, this is what the world is going to be like, and this is where we're going to be living. How are we affected by all of this in our lives? He says there are going to be people having a form of godliness, but they're phonies, saying they're of God, but they're really not, because their fruits are not showing it. Verse 7, he goes on, ever learning and never able to come to the knowledge of the truth. No truth in them. He's not just talking about worldly people, people that don't know anything about God. He's letting us know this includes us as well. We're living in the end time, and these things are things that can be affecting how we are living in our life today. They have never able to come to the knowledge of the truth. It means there's no truth in them. They resist truth. Verse 8, and as Jannes and Jambres withstood Moses, and they were tricksters and jugglers and magicians, so do these also resist or oppose against the truth men of corrupt minds, reprobate concerning the faith. But they shall proceed no further, for their folly shall be manifest unto all men, as theirs was also. Just the way it was with Moses' tricksters that were trying to disrupt things. The phonies will be revealed. So Paul is telling us. We're going to come to see the reality of these things. How? Through God's Word. Because that's where we're being told about all of this. And the NLT version, verse 9 reads, but they won't get away with this for long. Someday everyone will recognize what fools they are, just as with James and Jambres. Qualities that we see Paul discussing can be seen in us if we're allowing hypocrisy to get a hold of our lives. If we're allowing that to happen. So we here see, now if we go back to Revelation chapter 3. Revelation chapter 3, we see here the characteristics of the time that we're now living in, again. The attitude that permeates the last era of the church of God. Revelation chapter 3 and verse 14. Revelation 3 and verse 14. And to the angel of the church of the Laodiceans write, these things, says the Amen, the faithful and true witness, the beginning of the creation of God. His displeasure may be first noticed, if you picked it up. His displeasure may be seen in his addressing them as not the church in Laodicea, because if you look at the other churches read the church in Sardis, the church in Smyrna, the church in Thyatira, the church in Pergamos. He's saying here, this is the church of the Laodiceans. It's like it's their church. It's not the church of the Laodicea, in the Laodicea. It's the church of the Laodicea. This is their church. They're controlling it, the end time. not God. Verse 17, he goes on and says, because you say, I am rich and increased with goods and have need of nothing, and know not that you are wretched and miserable and poor and blind and naked. Another list of evil things that the end time church is going to be going through. That word wretched means contemptible, despicable, inferior in performance or quality. Their condition is such that they can't see themselves as Christ sees them. And this is the church at the end time, Church of God today, Laodicean church, rich and increased. And what area doesn't this fit? Money, material things, spiritually more understanding than any time in the history of mankind, also more critical, condemning, judgmental than ever before. We don't have to turn there, but you know the account in Matthew chapter 7 where Jesus says, remove the beam from your eye. Don't judge your brother. Remove the beam from your eye so you can see that he has a little tiny speck, but you've got this big telephone pole coming out of your eye. Remove the beam that's in your eye. More judgmental than ever before. How many people, brethren, today, in any of the churches that we know about, how many will admit that they are hypocrites? Who can admit that? Just like we read earlier, going in and finding out what leaven is, you don't want to accept it. No one wants to accept that they're a hypocrite. No one voluntarily waves their hand and says, I am a hypocrite. What is at the root core of hypocrisy? The root core is self-righteousness and arrogance. It's something that's hidden deep inside the hypocrite. It's an attitude that they are right and better than others. And the church at the end time will reflect this quality. They sat in the best seats. The self-righteous person is ignorant of God's righteousness. Turn to Romans chapter 10. Romans chapter 10 and verse 3. He says here, for they being ignorant of God's righteousness and going about to establish their own righteousness and have not submitted themselves unto the righteousness of God. Talking about Israel's problems, and we can apply that to ourselves as well. Being ignorant of God's righteousness, we have not submitted ourselves unto God's righteousness. The word self-righteous in the Webster's dictionary means exclusively or hypocritically pious, sure of one's righteousness, confident of one's own righteousness, especially when smugly or moralistic and intolerant of the opinions and behaviors of others. Self-centered and arrogant and self-righteous. A hypocrite is one who thinks he can live after the flesh and after the spirit. See, the Pharisees were convinced that they were right. Whatever they were saying and doing was right. What do you mean you're not washing the cup and you're not washing your hands? What's wrong with you? How are you healing and raising someone from the dead on the Sabbath? What, are you not keeping the Sabbath the way we're telling you? Romans chapter 8 and in verse 1. Romans 8 and verse 1. It says, there is therefore no condemnation to them which are in Christ, who walk not after the flesh, but after the Spirit. For the law of the Spirit of life in Christ has made me free from the law of sin and death. For what the law could not do, in that it was weak through the flesh, God sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh, and for sin, condemned the sin in the flesh, and that righteousness of the law might be fulfilled in us, who walk not after the flesh, but after the Spirit. We don't want to focus on the physical, the flesh. We need to focus on the spiritual part of God's relationship with us. For they that after the flesh do mind the things of the flesh, but they that after the Spirit, the things of the Spirit. For to be carnally minded is death, but to be spiritually minded is life and peace. So we see here that the flesh is never satisfied. Hypocrisy becomes an addiction to cover our tracks and how we're living contrary to God's word. Verse 13, he says, "For if you live after the flesh, you shall die. But if through the Spirit you do mortify the deeds of the body, you shall live. For as many as that are led by the Spirit of God, they are the sons of God." So here we see, Paul is letting us know here that self-righteousness and arrogance is living flesh, not by the Spirit. It's going to bring death. 1 Timothy 4 and verse 1. 1 Timothy 4 and verse 1. We need to understand that nothing is going to change in our life without God's Spirit dwelling in us and leading us as how we are to live. We've got 6,000 years of man trying to make this work after taking that fruit from the garden, and it hasn't worked. So nothing is going to change without God's Spirit dwelling in us. 1 Timothy 4 and verse 1. "And the Spirit expressly speaks that in the latter times shall certain fall away from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits and teachings of demons." Verse 2, "And hypocrisy, speaking lies, being seared in their own conscience," meaning slowly acceptance of living two different ways. So at first the conscience is content and at peace because it's only a small infraction. I mean, this is only a small thing that has happened that we've done wrong. So the conscience, our conscience, isn't making it a big deal. But eventually the conscience is upset, and the depth to which the tolerance and the indulgence to which the intolerance and the indulgence has led our life. So God has given us a conscience that we are to be using in a right way. So we don't disrupt the conscience. We are to be using it to notice things that are not right. But when we abuse the conscience, what happens? We don't see it as being wrong. Then what happens, if that happens, then the hypocrite goes from enjoying his performance to despising himself. This is what the conscience eventually winds up doing to somebody. Makes them feel like, wow, this is what I've been doing? Romans 7 and verse 24. Romans 7 verse 24, it says, "What a wretched man I am! Who will rescue me from this body of death?" The end of the hypocrite is that he feels dirty and cheap, and his life becomes miserable and a miserable existence. One of the Hebrew words for hypocrite means to soil or corrupt greatly, or to pollute or profane, or to be unwilling to do something or to let it happen. And eventually, what happens to that person? Eventually, they're going to say, "How wretched and miserable I am." The physical Pharisees could only understand the physical righteousness. Therefore, they had a physical or carnal obedience. Keeping the law in the letter became the end of itself. That's all they had. Just keep the letter of the law. That's all they were interested in. Christ warns us to beware, because carnal obedience will lead people to stop eating unclean meats, to quit working on the Sabbath, and to tithe. So there are physical things that people can be doing once they see the letter of the law, and they'll be doing it. Not that it's wrong, like Christ told the Pharisees. Tithing wasn't wrong. But doing those things, if it's only done on a physical basis, becomes a self-righteous approach. And one way to spot a carnal obedience is by its instability. Carnal obedience goes off in wild tangents, or it becomes fanatical, where people get so strong that you've got to do it this way because this is what it has to be done. And yet, they're becoming what? Fanatical. The Pharisees were the best examples of wild tangents and fanaticism, because they were keeping just the physical law and never wanted to know about what Christ had to say or who he was. So how can we avoid this spiritual leaven from ensnaring us? How can we avoid this? Turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 5. Paul tells us what we're to be doing. 1 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 8. Paul says, "Therefore, let us keep the feast, not with old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth." You see, the hypocrite is completely insincere in what he's doing. only interested in the outward involvements. The word sincere means purity, genuine, unmixed, no deceit. And brethren, we're going to be judged by what exactly we are doing and what our motives are. So are we genuine in our thinking? Are we unmixed? Are we not being deceitful? 1 Corinthians chapter 13, in verse 1. 1 Corinthians 13, verse 1. Paul says here, though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels and have not charity, I become as a sounding brass and a tinkling cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have faith that I can remove mountains and have not charity, I'm nothing. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned and have not charity, it profits me nothing. Even doing good deeds, if love is not in there, he says, it profits nothing. You see, just physical efforts alone are worth nothing. Just physical things. I mean, even when he says taking care of the poor, he's doing a nice thing, but if it's only a physical way, not being done through love, then it profits nothing. Like, it's not that hard to write a check to somebody. Maybe someone needs some help, and you want to give them a little help and let them pay a bill or do something. You want to be that way with someone you're concerned about. Well, it's not hard to write a check, but how about being there for them when they need help? That's the love that needs to be there. That's the love that is missing, that Paul says has to be a part of us. Having godly love is the proof of sincerity. Romans chapter 12 and verse 9. Romans 12 and verse 9. Paul says here, let love be without dissimulation, meaning let it be sincere and anti-hypocritical, without dissimulation. Abhor that which is evil and do that which is good. Be kindly affectionate to one another, brotherly love and honor, preferring one another, not slothful in business, fervent in spirit, and serving the Lord. Having a love for one another, godly love. Not being critical, not being condemnatory, but having love for them. This phrase, without dissimulation, again, means without hypocrisy. In the NIV, the word is sincere. And the NIV reads Romans 12, verse 9, love must be sincere. Hate what is evil. Cling to that which is good. Be sincere. Paul here is describing a strong zeal for our commitment to be obeying and serving God and his people as part of our family. Romans chapter 2, verse 17. Romans 2, verse 17. Paul now says, now you, if you call yourself a Jew, if you rely on the law and brag about your relationship to God, if you know his will and approve of what is superior because you are instructed by the law, if you are convicted that you are a guide to the blind, a light for those who are dark, if you are an instructor to the foolish, a teacher of infants, because you have the law of embodiment or the knowledge and truth, verse 21, you then who teach others, do you not teach yourself? You who preach against stealing, do you steal? You who say that people should not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who brag about the law, do you dishonor God by breaking the law spiritually? He's talking about, are you living it? Are you just saying it, or are you doing it as well? The second element, besides sincerity, is that of truth that Paul brought out. John chapter 8. John chapter 8 and verse 31. Then Jesus said to those Jews which believed on him, if you continue in my word, then are you my disciples indeed. And you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. So if we are believing in Jesus Christ and what he says, we're his disciples, and we will know the truth, the real truth of God, what his word says. What will free us from hypocrisy is a deep love for God's worth and the truth. God's people at the end time must have the love of the truth of God, or the tribulation will come, and then they will learn it the hard way. The most important thing that we are to be doing today is to be living by the Word of God. It is the key to having a personal relationship with God. That is the most important thing, brethren, in our life as Christians, to have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ and the Father. That is the key. And by knowing God and seeking to do His will is how it is accomplished. Jesus set us that example of not doing His will, but the will of the Father. Studying God's Word, eating it, drinking of it. Each day we eat unleavened bread during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And then we're reminding ourselves of being what Christ is. After 7 days, you know that a habit can be broken. So the Pharisees made the oral law more important than the Word of God. John chapter 6 and verse 32. Jesus came to them and said, truly I say to you that Moses gave you not that bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he which comes not down from heaven and gives life to the world. But for the bread of heaven, of God, is he which does come down from heaven and gives life to the world. And they said to him, Lord, evermore give us this bread. And Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. He that comes to me shall never hunger, and he that believes on me shall never thirst. But I said to you that you also have seen me and believe not. Dropping down to verse 48. I am that bread of life. Your fathers did eat the manna in the wilderness, and they're dead. This is the bread that comes down from heaven, that any man may eat thereof and not die. I am the living bread which came down from heaven. And if any man eat this bread, he shall live forever. And the bread that I will give is my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world. So we have to ask ourselves, do we have that love for the truth, the Word of God, the manna, which is Jesus Christ, that God sent to us? Are we eating this Word on a daily basis? The results of eating the bread permeated by God's law is spiritual strength. Unleavened bread, God gives spiritual strength to ensure victory in life. The unleavened bread that God gives. Turn to the book of Acts, chapter 17. Acts 17 in verse 10. We see here that Paul brought the word of God to Thessalonica. And some of the Jews and devout Greeks, including the women, had believed. Yet the Jews who believed not left the city, were in the city, when he left, were in an uproar when he was in Thessalonica. So in chapter 17, verse 10, and the brethren immediately sent away Paul and Silas by night into Berea, who coming there went into the synagogue of the Jews. And these were more noble than those in Thessalonica, that they might receive the word with all readiness of mind, and search the scriptures daily, whether those things were so. So whose examples are we following today? Are we holding on to the traditions like the Jews or the Bereans, whose example was to investigate new teaching in comparison with the Bible? Are we following the Bereans, or are we following the Pharisees' approach? Romans chapter 12 and verse 1. Paul reminds us here of how we are to be living. Romans 12 and verse 1. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. And be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove that which is good and acceptable and the perfect will of God. We are supposed to be with God's Spirit, we are transforming our mind from what it was to be able to prove what is good and acceptable by God. By proving His Word, to know what it says, as the Bereans did. Renewing our minds means changing how we think, how we act, and by studying the Word of truth. Verse 3, he goes on, for I say, through the grace given to me, to every man that is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to, but to think soberly, according as God has dealt to every man the measure of faith. The last point we want to look at here is that since one of the major infections is self-righteousness, The opposite of that is meekness and humility. They're the antidote to this poison. Sincerity, truth, and humility. Luke chapter 8 and verse 9. Luke 8 and verse 9. To some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everybody else, Jesus told this parable. 2 men went out to the temple to pray. One a Pharisee, the other was a tax collector. The Pharisee stood up and prayed about himself. And he said, God, I thank you that I'm not like other men, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector over here. Rather, I fast twice a week. I give 1/10 of all I have. But as the tax collector stood at a distance, he would not even look up to God. But he beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. I tell you that this man, rather than the other, the Pharisee, went home justified before God. Notice, for everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. When we are acting with a humble mind, God will bless us and raise us to where we need to be. 2 Timothy chapter 2. 2 Timothy 2, verse 24. It says, and the servant of the Lord must not strive, but be gentle to all men, apt to teach, patient, in meekness, instructing those that are opposing themselves. If God peradventures, he will give them repentance to the knowledge of the truth, that they may recover themselves out of the snares of the devil, who are taken captive by him at his will. A hypocrite does not consider himself a servant. To be gentle, we need to view others better than ourselves, than what we are. To do our good deeds in secret, not from a platform and making known how wonderful we are. This holy day emphasizes God's forgiving our sins by Jesus paying our penalty of death with his life. How forgiving are we to others? Do we have a root of bitterness? A hypocrite patterns a double-minded and polluted godliness. How often do we think that we know what we know is best? Or do we reject or argue what others say? Or do we insist on having things done our way? Do we criticize other people when they make mistakes? Do we justify criticisms and lack of love? Do we think of ourselves better than others or more spiritual than others? Do we get impatient with others? How are we living? According to the wording that Jesus Christ told us, be careful of the leaven of the Pharisees. Let's turn in closing to 2 John. 2 John, and in verse 7. 2 John, verse 7. It says, for many deceivers have gone out into the world, those who do not confess the coming of Jesus Christ in the flesh, such as one is the deceiver and the antichrist. Those that are preaching anything contrary to God's word is a deceiver and an antichrist. Verse 8, watch yourselves so that you may not lose what we have worked for, but will win a full reward. Verse 9, everyone who goes on ahead and does not abide in the teachings of Jesus Christ does not have God. Whoever abides in the teaching has both the Father and the Son, if we're following Christ as the teacher. If anyone comes to you and does not bring this teaching, do not receive him into your house or give him any greeting. Verse 11, for whoever greets him will take part in his wicked works, be caught up in the deceitfulness of the Pharisee. So brethren, while heresy or hypocrisy is a common trait of human nature, it is not a condition that we have to remain in. We can change it. We can prevent it. We can stop it short with the help of God's Spirit and our sincere desire to take Christ, have his mind living in us, that we can overcome it. Let's be aware of the leaven of the hypocrite and the hypocrisy of the Pharisees, what it means. What are we to be doing to change? 1, that we strive to be sincere in our relationship with God and man. 2, that the love of the truth makes it part of our daily life. And number 3, that we put on the humility that reflects the mind and character of Jesus Christ in us.